So I should probably begin by saying this is a rather odd talk of me to give. This talk is going to be kind of all over the place. I'm trying to argue something for which I have insufficient evidence, and which is much bigger than anything that I can really adequately discuss in an hour. So I'm just going to sort of rant for a long time, and I hope it will be interesting. That's my talk's about Kafka, Franz Kafka, whose books I have here. Yay! But before I talk about Kafka specifically, I want to just mention for a second some stuff about literature that's going to sort of give this talk its shape. So, sort of the modern, by which I mean post-recorded history, approach to texts is that there is at least a possibility of interpreting text. Interpretation of a text is something that is somehow good. So, a good place to start is, what is it possible to gain from interpreting a text? Another way of saying this is, why ought we to read at all? And there's a bunch of different responses you can give. My personal favorite for just being absolutely bizarre is Plato's, the whole moral education one. Everything you read informs how you act. That is it. You read in order to become a better person. There's a direct linear equivalence between what you read, or what's depicted in what you read, and how you as a person are. Aristotle had his theory of catharsis, right? You read to sort of purge yourself of emotions. He focused on tragedy, but I can sort of blow this out of proportion because I'm going fast and not really caring. There are arguments that you read so you get a deeper understanding of something, even if only on a very analytical level. This is not one that I particularly agree with, but John Milton, in the beginning of Paradise Lost, mentions that he's writing to justify the ways of God to man. There's this theory that if you read Milton and interpret him correctly, you will suddenly understand God, which is complete bunk, but whatever. There's a bunch of these. They just keep going on and on. The ones that are more correct sort of tend to be vaguer. One of the ones with which I resonate more is a description by Henry James, where he's talking about how the experience one has, that is sort of what you feel, can be utterly unrelated in how big it is to what actually happened. You can go through a fairly mundane set of events as a person and be deeply moved by them. So conversely, literature sort of extends your ability to experience things. You read in order to experience emotions and feelings you can't otherwise. And then there is just a great line: a book should serve as the axe for the frozen sea within us. That's a line from Kafka. All of these are kind of interesting. All of them are deeply flawed. But I list them for a specific reason. We all generally assume that there's something to gain by reading. That's one of the starting points I'm going to base my talk on. I'm not going to discuss the question of, is it possible to gain something by reading texts? I think that's a stupid question. I think we do gain by reading. So that is one of the things I will just assume. Now, brief 5-minute rant on getting all of literary theory wrong. I'm about to get all of literary theory wrong, that is. Saying that you can gain something when you read opens up the door to sort of normative claims. You can say this reading is good because you gain more by reading this way, right? Generally, the people who make those types of claims the loudest are also the ones who have the most narrow views of what you gain by reading. Plato makes a huge, very explicit, normative claim about what text you should and should not read. He's also famous for having one of the more narrow views on what you can gain by reading. Sort of the broader you get, the more the normative claims sort of fade and vanish. By the time you get to sort of modern writers, you have, by contrast, the theory that all readings of a text stand on some sort of equal footing. And that's actually a really good position. I think very highly of it. The plurality of readings is a very important thing. So of course I'm going to disagree with that entirely right now. I'm going to adopt a rather naive stance that you can still say that some reading is strictly better than another. I think this isn't entirely wrong, but it's certainly oversimplifying. But for the purposes of my talk, I need to start this way. Because what I'm going to do in my talk is I'm going to argue that we should not read Kafka the way Kafka reads Kafka, or the way Kafka wants us to read Kafka. I mean, going back pretty much throughout recorded history is the question of whether the author's intent dictates how you should read a work of literature. And it's an old idea that gains some loudness in modern times is the idea that the author does not control the text, right? You can read independent of authorial intent. This is a little more radical in that. I'm going to argue that we should not read according to authorial intent. The author is wrong in a very bad way about his own work. Reading Kafka the way Kafka intended us to read Kafka kind of removes the whole point of reading Kafka. So that's going to be the end point of my entire talk, just to get that out of the way. Okay, now the part that's actually about Kafka. So, I'm going to plug a few specific books here. There are lots of histories of Kafka's life, but only one of them comes in graphic novel form. It is quite excellent. It's Kafka by Robert Crumb and David Zane Merowitz. I don't know the latter, who is the author, but Crumb, who's the illustrator, is a fantastic guy, and you should all read his stuff. It's a pretty good biography of Kafka. Kafka was an interesting case. The sort of image of Kafka that's portrayed throughout all of descriptions of Kafka is very depressed, very depressing, very self-judging, very uncomfortable with himself, very alternately angry and submissive to everything around him. Just generally a negative person. This is actually a pretty accurate description of Kafka. Kafka is famous for ordering his best friend to burn all of his works when he died. He says this not in one letter, like not on his deathbed. He actually orders his friend to do this multiple times throughout his life, in several rather large letters. Whether he actually wanted his friend Max Brod to do this is a good question, because Max Brod also told Kafka that he would not burn his works. And then Kafka entrusted all of his works to Brod, and then told him to burn them. So it's unclear exactly what Kafka wanted out of all of this, whether he wanted his works to be kept, or wanted sort of the ability to say that he wanted them burned, whether he wanted to give Max Brod an epic guilt trip, which I would not put past Kafka, whether he was of two minds and couldn't decide whether he wanted his work burned or not. That's probably the most plausible one, but Kafka was of many more than two minds, so it's unclear. It is certainly true that he had a very low opinion of his own work. There's a letter in which he writes that only 6 of his stories should ever be allowed to see the light of day. And he's not even saying that these 6 ought to. He's saying, if by some mistake all of my work is not burned, these are the only ones I won't be deeply furious about surviving. They're in the Penal Colony, Metamorphosis, those are ones that you guys have probably heard of at some point. The Hung Artist, that one a few of you may have heard. And then 2 other stories that are not as widely read, The Country Doctor and The Judgment. And they're all his most depressing stories. So he's sort of got this... Oh, sorry, and The Stoker, which is equally depressing. He's sort of got this vibe of really hating everything he does. He's a negative person. That's also too simplistic an image of Kafka to paint. Kafka had a few really interesting things he did. First of all, he had huge humanitarian works. Kafka was one of those people for whom writing was not actually a job. He wrote by night, right, and had a day job, and his day job was going over safety procedures in factories and fixing them. His big sort of project that he felt most proud of was he was responsible for drawing up a huge body of information on how workers tended to lose fingers in large factory machines. His work was actually appreciated. He changed a lot of safety procedures in factories, and by some accounts saved hundreds of lives. And he was quite aware of this. So, despite being a horribly depressed person, he was also sort of deeply involved with trying to make people's lives better. He didn't think that he was making a huge difference, but he was aware that he was making a difference, and he really valued that. It's shown through his letters. So he's not quite as depressing as he may be made out to be. There's another thing I want to sort of get out of there, which is one of the things most associated with Kafka is sort of judicial procedures that make no sense, right? The term Kafkaesque is often used to describe being involved in a trial that you don't understand. That's actually a direct reference to The Trial, where the main character is involved in a trial they don't understand. The thing is, the way this is most frequently read is that this is a weird occurrence, right? It's Kafkaesque and strange, something that doesn't happen. That's actually not true. Kafka was writing in Czechoslovakia. At the time he was writing, that was a fairly accurate description of the Czech justice system. So also, a lot of what we take as sort of surrealistic in Kafka